Hey everybody, you're listening to Trailer Rewind, a monthly conversation about movies you may have missed in theaters and are now available on streaming services. Every month we dig into the archives and view a film that Pete and Andy talked about in their trailer picks. JJ and I watch it and have a very spoilery conversation about it, and today we're looking at Miss Sloane. So this was Pete's pick from September 22nd, 2016. Today's October 10th, and Miss Sloane is available on Amazon Prime. Now, before we go any further, you should check out our ever-expanding back catalog for this show and its sibling shows at thenextreel.com. If you've stumbled upon us, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app or follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Next Reel. And whether you've just found us or have been a listener for a while, you can be part of our community. Supporting us as a patron on patreon.com/thenextreel gets you into our Slack group where there's always a fun conversation going on about films. And you also get exclusive Patreon-only weekly Saturday matinee episodes, the new home of trailer picks and discussions of weekly film news and lists. And we love our list. This week we had I've been like sort of blacklisted on the list actually.
What?
Because well,
Why?
a couple weeks ago it was just me and Pete, and he let me go first, and all of my picks were his picks.
Oh.
So every time, so I kept one-upping him. So now the new rule is Steve does not get to go first.
Okay.
So I always get to sort of cast to the side and have to wait for Pete and Andy to go through at least their first pick before I get to chime in. But we've been having some really interesting discussions. The lists are always based on the film that they've discussed sort of in the main show.
Oh, cool.
So it's always sort of a fun thematic connection to see what types of films we come up in our lists.
Yep.
So definitely check out the Saturday matinees. So for Miss Sloane,
Yes.
Pete picked this one, and he noted that there were a lot of fantastic names associated with this. He named director John Madden, Jessica Chastain, and he said he is a fan of hers and he was likely to go see it, and that it was going to be a culturally important film like The Big Short and Snowden, a film that was taking on important issues for us to talk about. Tell me, what did you think about this overlooked film?
Well, it was totally overlooked. I'm glad that you mentioned that because even for me, while I saw all the names, that Pete talked about in the trailer rewind, and it looked like it was a strong film, I'll say it that way, it didn't look like it was poorly made or anything. I didn't have any desire to see this in the theater. Didn't think it was special at all. I like, you talk about what we do here on Trailer Rewind, and it's really trying to sort of show people movies that they might not have caught when they were in the theater. And looking at the way that this movie did, I think it had a $15 million budget, and it made $3.4 million total. So that means it didn't get out there. And the interesting thing about this movie is that I think it's really, really strong, and especially in terms of story. So for me, I didn't guess what was happening any way through it. It was kind of like a mystery, and I kept wondering the whole time through if it was based on a real story. And from what I can find, now correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I can find, this was all created in the mind of a screenwriter, someone who has only written this film and was the only person writing this movie. I think that's remarkable, and really the story is really special here. And if you are a lover of film story and the kind of thing where I'm going to say, if you like not being spoiled in movies, you should turn off this podcast right now and you should go watch this movie, because there's a lot in this movie that goes into the mystery of something like The Usual Suspects, or something really deep from a mystery perspective about political lobbying drama that is really special, that had me guessing all the way. And even at the end, I was completely guessing wrong. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I was fortunate enough to see this in theaters, because I'm a big fan of Jessica Chastain, and this was one of those films that I said, let me go see this because it's out in theaters near me. It looks interesting, and if I don't see it now, I'm probably going to forget it. And I'm really interested. So I went out and saw that and just came back and thought, oh my gosh, everybody needs to know about this movie. How are people not talking about this film? And it was released in like late 2016, and maybe it was just overshadowed by a lot of the other sort of more traditional Oscar hyped contenders. But you look at this cast and you look at this type of story, and to me, it's one of these really smart films directed at, adults. This isn't like a teen movie or something that appeals to families. This is mature grown-ups going to watch a film to engage in sort of art that is going to have them ask questions about things. And it's a movie you go see and then you sit down with somebody that you hopefully have seen it with to talk about what this movie's doing. And I think it was maybe asking perhaps too much of people, or there were just too many other films out there that pushed it out, because I couldn't stop talking about this film. And so when it came to, Trailer Rewind, I thought this is the perfect vehicle, because it's something that everybody just should give a chance to this movie.
Now, this wasn't necessarily this wasn't nominated for any Oscars, was it?
No, not that I'm aware of. It just sort of came out in that like between Thanksgiving and New Year's sort of window, where usually that's where your Oscar movies are being promoted, because everybody goes to see movies during the holidays, and that's where you'll see things sort of being positioned for placement for, Oscar contention. But I'll take a look. But I think probably dumbfounded that there wasn't any attention, awards time for this film.
Yeah, I guess the reason why I ask is because my first thing that I think about is what could they have done differently to promote this movie in a way, or what would be the story that people might be talking about. And I try to think of films that I like this, and I think for me the reason why I ignored it, I straight up ignored it when it was in the theater, because I didn't know anything about it that would compel me to go see it. And it is such a story-driven piece. I don't know how I could have promoted the film differently in a way that would have gotten people to get their butts in the seats and go watch the movie. Now, when we talk about which movies it's like, I think about like Michael Clayton, but that had Oscar nominations, or like Aaron Brockovich. These kind of things that are really sort of, Michael Clayton was about corporate drama, and Aaron Brockovich was, of course, this legal piece. And then I also talk about Spotlight. But each of those movies, which was about the child abuse in Catholic churches, each of those movies did get Oscar buzz. So I'm thinking this movie is on par with those in terms of story for me. Did you feel that way?
Oh yeah, to me this is like, I think of Michael Clayton and this film sort of like side by side, because there's something about
that was immediately my thought.
Yes, there's sort of a mystery going on. You've got this really solid performance that's really carrying this film, but great supporting cast around it. And there's something just about the tone to the story and the way it's structured and filmed with both of these that just come just straight at you. And it's not gonna sort of lull you in like, oh, we're gonna soften the edges on this. It's just gonna come right at you, and it's not gonna tell you everything. There's information that's hidden. You're sort of along for the ride, figuring things out as this film goes along with both of these. And I love films like this, and I wish there were more of them out there, because they just do what they do so well.
Right. And I think in general, most people love films like this when they're story driven. But to be honest, Michael Clayton was probably my favorite film that came out that year. And I think when I try to think of what genre this is, drama is sort of the big catch-all that all these films go into. But I don't know how I can identify these movies for myself when they're in the theater. That being said, I don't know that it was important that I saw it in the theater. I'm very happy that I've seen it now. I'm very happy that I was exposed to the story now, because it's the kind of writing that I think makes the film medium really special.
Yeah, I think it is, the challenge of how do you categorize this, because drama is such a broad term that covers all kinds of stories. And you don't want to say mystery, although there is a mystery or suspense to this. It's not necessarily a whodunit, and it's not really a thriller there, but it's a drama that has questions and mysteries to solve in the story, and I guess I want to say suspense to a certain extent, because the big story is, getting into it of, you've got Miss Sloane, who is this, top-notch, powerful lobbyist who decides to abandon the firm that she's at to go with a smaller firm based on the issue, which has to do with gun control and gun rights. And she chooses to go work at this smaller firm. And then the big question is she going to be successful? And sort of that's the question driving this. And I guess maybe that is the genre. Is instead of question driven, it's more, instead of action driven or conflict driven, it's question driven.
Yeah, well, and that's good. Now, in your quick synopsis there of the story, I have questions for you that immediately jump into spoilers. And before I ask these questions, I also want to say that I love spoilers. That's part of the reason why I love being part of this show, this podcast. But beyond that, this movie was good enough to make me worry about giving away spoilers, because it's so great to experience this film and walk through it not knowing what's coming next. So, but that being said, let's talk spoilers.
Well, I think well, let's give everybody a big warning, and I think it is, big spoilers coming, and I think it will impact your enjoyment of this film if you get spoiled. And so I think at this point, I'd say pause the show, go to Amazon Prime or what other online streaming service, watch the film, and then come back to our conversation, because this is a very rewarding journey to go on, and to spoil it, I think, is going to just shortchange yourself. So don't do it.
I 100% agree. The percentage of movies that fall into that category for me are less than 1%. But that being said, this is one of them. And so right away, getting into something that's really spoilery, you said that she made the decision to leave her big firm because of the issue. Do you truly believe that? Because I don't. I think that because of the way this film plays out, that she just wanted to slay the biggest dragon. And that's why she did it. But maybe that's the same thing. She saw the challenge of beating the gun lobby as the biggest thing she could do. Whereas, wow, it's so many layers to this movie, and everything is orchestrated. She's the puppet master.
No, and that's a good point, because there is a question early on of like, why is she taking a stance on this issue? She hasn't done that with other issues. It's always about, the challenge of the work. And, why is she taking a moral stance on this? Clearly
never takes a moral stance on anything.
Right. A woman with no morals who will do whatever it takes to win is now taking a stand and saying, whoa, I'm not willing to side with the gun lobbies. I'm not doing this. And is that her strategy, her seeing the opportunity to be the big underdog to take down, one of the biggest political forces? That's a good question. And again, I don't know that there's a clear answer, but I think that's one of the strengths of this film, is trying to really understand her and what she's seeking out to do, and how much is an intentional part of plan and what isn't, which is, I think, the thrill of how this story is structured, is looking at how everything falls into place and trying to figure out which parts she's in control of and which are parts that she's not, and then how does she respond to those situations that she hasn't gotten control of.
And that's why it's fair to bring up a movie like The Usual Suspects, in that you throughout the movie are focused on one character, or we'll say one story, and then you realize at the end that anything that you at some point perceived as character development for that character might have been just part of their story and not about who they are as a person. So Miss Sloane, Liz Sloane, is not someone you learn about in this movie. It is not a movie about her. It is about this story and what she does. She's defined by her action, and that does not tell us anything about who she is as a person. And I think that's fascinating. I think the way that this film plays out, in that the way that it's written, is for you to become intimate with this person, and by the end you've realized that there is no intimacy, that everything you've learned is actually potentially part of a plan. And I think that's so fantastic.
So I'm going to come back to our first question of what your expectations were, because I see that you had, different expectations about the story. And I think that may be one of the barriers to this film as far as what this film is really about.
Well, in general, I didn't know much about the movie going in, because I said, literally, I ignored it when it was in the theaters, which is unfair. But it was, I don't know what could have changed my mind about that. That being said, as I read about it and as I learned about it in preparation for the podcast, I thought it was really going to be focused on the gun debate. And the interesting thing is that the gun debate, while used in the film as a very as the sort of touchstone inflammatory issue that it is in American politics today, it really doesn't have anything to do with what this story is about. It's more used as a puzzle piece to create the drama that the story is around. And I think I think that was great. So I expected it was going to be really focused on the issue, and that in and of itself became a red herring for the way that you approach the film.
Yeah, and that's something that on the second time viewing this, as I'm sitting there watching everything play out, when it gets to the end, and I realize this, you could have swapped out guns for any other political issue in this story could work. And what's another powerful lobby that's out there? Because it doesn't really take a stance one way or the other. Because I think we see a lot of scenes that are centered around debate about gun rights and Second Amendment and whether or not you can put restrictions on those constitutional rights. And then there's a lot of, I think, useful facts from both sides of the debate that play into these scenes. But the film itself, I don't think is taking a stance one way or the other. Ultimately, when it comes down to how this is resolved, as you said, it's a lot more about lobbying and power and manipulation, and not so much as guns are bad or guns are a right and we need to figure out how to manage them. It doesn't answer that question. No matter, even when it ends and you're having an emotional response to this ending, it's not like, yay, I'm a pro-gun person and this supports it, or yay, I'm opposed to guns and this is something that I can use. It sort of effectively nullifies that and makes it about so much more in politics, which, as I think is one of the great things about this film, is really pointing out what the problems are, what the issues are with the lobbying, sort of industry in Washington.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it is that is the sort of the fulcrum of the film, is that it spins upon the lobbying industry, and that ultimately the sort of decision was the lobbying industry was the target the entire time.
So I do want to get into the cast because there are so many names.
Spoiler.
There are so many names and familiar faces in this that again, for a first-time writer to have a script that is attracting this caliber talent to it, and to know that really he was the only one that worked on this, is, I think, just there's probably a lot of struggling writers out there just cursing his name, saying, damn you, Jonathan Perera, you're living the dream. You wrote a script and you got John Madden to direct it, and you have cast Jessica Chastain, Mark Strong, Allison Pill, Christine Baranski, John Lithgow, Michael Stuhlbarg, Sam Waterston. When does that happen? Right. That does not happen. He's living a dream.
Literally, I don't know. I can't think of another example, like especially in drama, with this sort of genre in mind.
And just to look at the level of performance that they all bring to this film, as I find it really humorous looking at having just reviewed Kingsman 2, last month for the Film Board, and Mark Strong as Merlin in that, but to see him as Rodolfo Schmidt in this one, I just look at him as he's somebody I want to pay more attention to, because I've now sort of seen the range of what he does, and he's one of those those guys where you're like, oh yeah, I've seen him in things before, but really here I just really fell in love with him a little bit more as sort of that character actor of, I want to pay attention to him, because he's a real interesting counterpoint to Elizabeth Sloane and the dynamics of their relationship, of how he brings her on board thinking, I've got this opportunity, but then, as you bring up, is she really using him and all of his people to ultimately reach her goal? And I think it creates an interesting dynamic in their relationship, because he, I think, sort of has gotten a hold of a beast that he doesn't quite know how to control, or knows if he can control, but knows he can use her to hopefully to get to his end. But I think he finds himself in a lot of questionable positions based on sort of her morality and judgment. I think particularly of the scene where he's tailing her and she's, off in some back alley meeting with the tech nerds that have, been able to mount a camera on a cockroach and a microphone and just some real high-tech surveillance stuff that he's got huge problems with, and calls her out on it.
Were you followed?
Evidently. Let him in.
Wow, look at this. I'm guessing this gear ain't for tuning my 69 Chevy.
Rodolfo, my unofficial support team.
Big Sam.
Little Sam.
And your ex?
NSA.
Without prejudice to the undoubtedly stellar job that you guys do, Our firm has certain standards below which I am not prepared to stoop. Let me out of here.
Schmidt.
Find another way.
Yeah, well, and that now, but this leads your point to one of the greatest things about this movie is what is organic, what part of the story happened because that's what happens, and what part of the story was part of her plan. And there's no, I think lots of pieces, unless they were specifically explained that way in the film, could be argued either side. Do you think that she wanted him to tail her and then confront her on the use of that surveillance?
Yes, because I don't know. I think so, because when you think of what role that plays in her plan, and again, it's trying to keep track of, cause and effect and consequence to each thing. So if he follows her and he tells her, no, you're not going to do this, and she's like, okay, I'm not going to use this, but she does.
So you have to create this kind of spectrum of how much each of these individual pieces that are used in the hearing ultimately move her case towards the side of believability or to the end that she wants to meet. That, and also, for example, the male escort, when he comes in.
Yeah.
Is that it was his landmark testimony that backed her up, strangely. Did she plan that? Because I don't think so, but you can't tell, and that's one of the main issues. So her character, her mini-me, she's called at the smaller firm, Esme Manucherian, which they play a lot with the name of that, is played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw, and she's used as a pawn in much of this, where her life is threatened, and she's made to do a lot of things. And part of the breakdown in their relationship is, how can you trust someone that is pulling so many strings that you never know when they're actually being honest with you? And that's really the beauty of this film, is that if even going back in review, how much is part of her plan and what wasn't? And was it just fortunate that it all came out the way that she wanted to, or did she plan it the whole time?
Well, and that's sort of the thrill of this film, is sort of second guessing everything, because it's not just it's just her. You've also got the gun lobby, and looking at, particularly the scene where we have Esme is just left and she's walking out in the street, and there's somebody comes after her and is stopped by your stereotypical good guy with a gun.
Yep.
And it totally turns the tables on them. And my wife looked at me as we were watching this, and she said, did the gun lobby plant that guy? Was that a whole setup to make make it look like, hey, it's good to have typical citizens with guns? Are we at that level of manipulation? And I sort of looked at her and shrugged my shoulders, because first off, I'm not spoiling anything, but secondly, I thought the exact same thing. Like,
was he planted by Elizabeth? Was he planted by Miss Sloane?
Exactly. And that's, you have to, at a certain point, say, I can question everything and get caught up in that, or I have to stop questioning and go with the story and see where things play out, and maybe save those questions for later, because it's impossible. You're not going to get the answers to everything. She is a master manipulator. And as you see everything come together in the end, it is extremely rewarding. But yeah, if you start to play that game, you can get wrapped up in such, sort of mental gymnastics of trying to figure out who's behind what and why and to what end, that I think it just makes the point that politics is a complex game.
Well, and I think the film is trying to tell us no, specifically the part where the good guy with a gun, after he bumps into her in the lobby, reaches down and picks up a pen and looks at it. So I think the film, from what it's trying to do, is trying to tell us, no, he wasn't planted. But then I think you go and you get to the final piece, and you finally learn about how much she was manipulating. And another movie that I compare it to is The Game with Michael Douglas. And I think about, at some point when you're within the game, in this place, the game of political lobbying, do you start to believe that everything is being controlled, that everything is being manipulated? Because I would. And in looking back in the film, I think there probably is a logic puzzle that you can put together that would have either side of that terribly tragic event controlling or manipulating that situation too. There's so much to talk about with it. It's great.
It is a talker. And I think, we could just end up probably going scene by scene through this entire movie.
Yes.
But I think one thing to talk about is sort of the dynamics of her with her team as we see that at both firms, which I think is interesting. You know, when she goes to leave and she's taking her team with her, and you've got Michael Stuhlbarg saying, look, I just went to bat for you. I just cleaned up this mess you made. You owe me, and now you're bailing on us. And she takes half her team.
Yep.
Just really sets up sort of the rivalry, which, I mean, and again, how much of it is her just riling him, you know, as part of the game. But I think what's really interesting is it creates that tension, that it's not just her leaving, it's now become personal for him, that he's really out to get her. So that the point when we get to the TV interview with the debate between the two of them, she knows how he works. He thinks he knows how she works. And it's sort of that dynamic and structuring the film of the opposition between the two of them that I think is also a tremendous strength to the story, because we've got somebody that thinks he knows how she works. He's worked with her for years. He knows it. Plus, some of her team has stayed behind, and he thinks now he can leverage that to his benefit. And that's where we get Alison Pill as Jane, who, you know, Jane is sort of was, you know, Elizabeth's, you know, right hand, and, you know, how she's going to be leveraged, he thinks, to, you know, get the information that they need on Elizabeth. And it turns out it is part of the much larger plan. But the structuring of that, I think, is, again, gets to that, what makes this film unique in its genre is that dynamic tension between those two characters in their quest to sort of defeat each other.
Universal background checks are an infringement. What part of shall not be infringed don't you get?
I get that that's the weakest, most mind-numbing retort in your impoverished arsenal. Sort of a last refuge for those with no real argument at all.
You're talking about the United States Constitution.
If they could produce a rational winning argument, I'd gladly migrate to their side. But because it says so in the Constitution, the Bible, or my horoscope, it's not a winning argument. It's a ripcord, an intellectual equivalent of a yellow pant-pissing wimp cowering behind mommy's skirt.
Why don't we bring this back?
No, let's not. Why don't we ask all the mothers out there who lost their children to an armed sociopath if they believe in his unimpeachable constitutional right to bear arms? Why not ask the terrified girl who locked herself in a janitor's closet at Bloomington High, forced to listen as her peers were being massacred?
So now when Jessica Chastain, when she's towards the end of the film, before one of the final court dates, when she freaks out and she screams and throws all of her paperwork on the floor.
Yes. Okay.
Why did she do that? The reason why I bring it up now is because we just talked about emotional drama as being part of calculation.
Yeah.
So that's a scene where instead of her being pit against her rivals, she's left to her own devices, and yet she still has this explosion of, in the moment it seems like frustration, followed by a brilliant moment of genius. But what is that if she's still the one that's orchestrating the whole thing in the first place?
Yeah, and that's the challenge with a film like this, when you've got a character that's
a MacGuffin, right?
And that's where on, you know, rewatch you have to think about who's there and who is this for, because if it's in the office and there's other people around, it's part of the game because it's a show she's putting on for everyone else. If she's the only one there, then you have to question, is this show for the audience to distract us or misdirect us, or is this actually truly her reaction and it's not deceitful on terms of the filmmaker trying to create a sense that, oh, here she is, she's angry and she's frustrated, she's out of control, she's really not. That's sort of the tricky balancing act with a film like this, and that's where I have to think about if she's performing, although we do see she is a master manipulator, can she be on 100% all of the time, even when no one's around? And what would the reason be for that?
Well, the important part for me is that you asked the question, is she performing for the audience, meaning us watching the film, to lead us down the path, whether it be right or wrong? That would be the piece of the story that you may have an advantage with because you've seen it a second time now. But if that were the case, then I would think that would be a place where the story actually fails a little bit, because The rest of it is done so well in the way that it delays release of information and the way that it finally explains the sort of the movements behind the scenes when it's appropriate. That's done so well that if there are those pieces of or moments when she's actually trying to lead the audience astray, I would think that that's actually kind of unfortunate to pair that with all the other great stuff that's in the story. So if I had one complaint, it would be that I don't necessarily understand what some of those solo scenes are for her. And if it was meant to manipulate me, then I'm not so happy about that. Otherwise, I don't really have any complaints.
Right. And that's where you always have to get to the question of, is there actually a human being that exists that is that smart and manipulative that they can be that, put on that quality of performance all the time, and for what reason? And I think
no, that's Hollywood magic.
It's Hollywood magic. And I think, again, I have to look at this film as a whole and say, you know what, those are some of those little things that, at least after two views, I'm still willing to give it that grace a little bit, to say, you got me. I went the whole way, and it's structured in a way, and it's delivered in such a way that it doesn't draw attention to it, because there's something about how it's either bookended by the other scenes where it's not drawing attention to itself in that way to say, hey, it doesn't make sense that she would be doing that. It seems like a natural progression. And even if you have to step back and think, oh, no, she's really in control, there are enough, I think, moments where we see that not 100% of things necessarily go her way. I think the whole issue with Ford is something that's really outside of her control, and it puts her off her game, and she's got to figure out and make decisions about how to play that. And I think she's experienced and intelligent enough to quickly react and adjust to that. So those moments, I can say, yes, there may be some anger that it's not going according to plan, but she's able to quickly regroup and adapt her plan to account for those things, which I think a good lobbyist can't account for necessarily 100%, but can at least have contingencies to allow for those things.
I think that because this is a bookended story of a master strategic plan, that it doesn't necessarily highlight the reality of the lobbying industry as much as it is sort of like a lobbying superhero story. In that, because I think that a lot of times when those eventualities that you can't plan for, or the things that don't go to plan, then they pivot and they end up going a different direction, which wouldn't work in a closed story like this. But I'm not upset about it either, because I'm really happy with the way this story came out.
So I guess the question is, how pleased are you with how this story came out? Where did it end up on your flick chart? Because it ended up really high on my flick chart.
So I'm glad that it ended up high for you, because I had the feeling as I was going through it that it was getting too high for me. And now, because you say very high, I don't think I'm going to be as high as you, which is great. So I feel less weird about where I ended up with it. In general, I think I'm a little bit bashful about how much I like this film, in that it feels so nondescript on the outside. But where it ends up for me, so I've got 158 total on my flick chart. It ends up at number 32, which is way high. It won some battles that I thought were really interesting. It's right below Mad Max Fury Road and right above Apocalypse Now. And you think about those, I mean, those are kind of big movies, right? To sit in there like that. And I don't even know how I feel about putting Miss Sloane above Apocalypse Now in terms of, film history and where it belongs. But I know how it works for me, and it definitely works in that spot right there.
So for me, I've got right now 282 movies. It is way up there at number 19.
Whoa! First page.
Oh yeah. So it is right above Hidden Figures at 20, and then just below the director's cut version of Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven. So, and I specify director's cut because those that have seen it know that it is a very different film from the theatrical release. This is, like an hour longer film. Andy just watched it, and you can find his review on Letterboxd. I finally convinced him to check out the director's cut. But yeah, this is up there in sort of like what I consider sort of the classics range of my thing. Because it just, to me, this is one of those rare films that, and I've nuked my flick chart, and so I haven't watched Michael Clayton recently to have it added in my flick chart, because I'm thinking it's probably going to end up somewhere around in that same range.
Yeah. Michael Clayton was a great movie for me too.
Yeah, just way the heck up there.
For Letterboxd, for me, again, it was weird. I really liked the movie, and I feel almost embarrassed about how much I liked it, being that I ignored it when it was in the theater. I give it a 4 stars. It's not. I kind of reserve my 5 stars for movies that I think are like my favorite films, and I don't think I'll ever say that about this movie. But what this movie did for me in those movies that I brought up in talking about Michael Clayton, Aaron Brockovich, Spotlight, is it showed me that there is an entire sort of subset of the drama genre that I love and that I need to pay more attention to. And whether it's about if it's a mystery or it's a sort of a twisting plot, I don't even know how to label it, but I need to pay more attention to those movies because I'm always going to like them. So this is definitely on the high side at 4 stars.
Oh, yeah. I've got it at 4.5. I think, cool. Which indicated by sort of being in my top 20. And I on the second watch, because the first watch, I wondered if I was going to be ranking it and rating it high just because of that low expectation. I wasn't sure what I was getting, and getting something so much more, sort of giving you that unexpected high of coming out of the film like, oh my gosh, this is so much more than I expected. But on the second viewing, to see really the architecture behind this and to see it still hold up, where you know where things are going, but the characters just, and the performances just keep you engaged all the way through, even though you know where it's going, that you know the ultimate, end game, but to see it and just still be thrilled and enjoy all the gameplay that goes through just is why it still stays up there. It's such a high level for me.
I think it deserves it. That's great.
All right. So, JJ, here at The Next Reel, we say that when the movie ends, the conversation begins, and I've enjoyed our talk about Miss Sloane. But now that this conversation is ending, it's time to start another movie. So what do you got coming up next?
So I am going to see the new, I know you guys just did, for the film board, you just did Blade Runner 2049, and I wasn't able to participate in that because one of the main reasons is because I didn't see the first Blade Runner. So I went out and saw the original Blade Runner on Sunday night. So this week I am going to see the late show of 2049, and I'm actually really excited for it. I didn't love the first Blade Runner. I think it's really special and really artistic, but I'm really interested to see how it connects to the new movie. How about you? What's next for you?
I've been like on movie binge. My brother was in town, so in addition to seeing Blade Runner, went and saw Battle of the Sexes, the Emma Stone and Steve Carell feature, which I really enjoyed. So I'm sort of taking it easy. I got a lot of TV to catch up on. I am looking forward to our next film board of Murder on the Orient Express.
November.
Or as I teased during our flick chart discussion, the Imagine Dragons video for a song in place of a feature film, because I still cannot wrap my head around why that song for that trailer for that movie just baffles me. And I guess part of it is, how do you get a younger audience to show up to a movie with a bunch of old people in it? And I hate to say that.
That's based on an Agatha Christie novel.
Right, based on and I hate to say it's old people, but Johnny Depp is showing his age. Michelle Pfeiffer is showing her age. Oh my. Yes, I'm feeling very old. Actually, in Battle of the Sexes, Elizabeth Shue is in that, and she is looking all of her 54 years of age, which I cannot believe she is that old. So I'm I'm going to go to where the young kids are on TV, and I'm really interested in a lot of the sort of superhero stuff that's showing up, because on Fox you've got The Gifted, which is a Marvel thing, and then Hulu has their Runaways thing, which I think is a Marvel property. So there's just a lot of fun superhero stuff that I'm looking forward to catch up on my television shows.
Marvel content is everywhere.
Well, everyone, if you haven't already, give us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps other film fans discover us, and we hope that you will help other film fans discover us, because there's nothing more thrilling than discovering a group of like-minded fans online. It's like finding a new home.
Community.
Yes, and once you found us, follow us on Facebook and Twitter for assorted film geekery posts during the week. Or even better, you can help The Next Reel by supporting us as a patron on Patreon. But the best thing you can do is go watch a movie with a friend and then sit down and have a conversation about it. And if it's one that's been discussed on any of our shows, let us know. We love hearing from you. Hondo.
Hondo!